The scrawny woman collapsed face first into the Colorado dirt, and everyone watching figured she would die before sunset. Clara Garrison had arrived in Silverton 3 weeks ago with her husband Thomas, a dreamer who had staked his claim on land so stubborn, even the rocks seemed to mock their efforts. The other homesteaders whispered that Thomas had chosen poorly, that the soil was cursed, that the creek running through the property dried up every summer and flooded every spring with a violence that washed away hope itself. But Thomas had insisted, and Clara, dutiful as the mountain sunrise, had followed him to this unforgiving corner of Colorado territory in the spring of 1881. Now Thomas lay 6 feet under the ground he had loved so foolishly, killed by a rattlesnake bite that had turned his leg black and his fever so high he had burned to the touch. Clara had buried him herself, digging through earth that fought her with every strike of the shovel, her small hands blistering and bleeding as she worked through the night. The preacher had come the next morning, spoken words over the grave, and then told her what everyone already knew. She should sell the claim and return east. A woman alone could not work this land. It was impossible, unthinkable. Clara had thanked him politely and returned to work. That had been 4 days ago, and in those 4 days, Clara Garrison had discovered something about herself that even she had not known. Grief was a fire, and it could burn in two directions. It could consume you until nothing remained but ash and memory, or it could forge you into something harder than you had ever imagined possible. Clara chose the latter. She chose to work until her body gave out, to labor until the pain in her muscles drowned out the pain in her heart, to prove to this God-forsaken land that she would not be beaten. She woke before dawn each morning, before even the roosters in town had begun their chorus. She worked Thomas's fields with a determination that bordered on madness, plowing rows with a hand plow that weighed nearly as much as she did, hauling water from the creek in buckets that left her shoulders screaming, clearing rocks from the soil until her fingers bled. The other homesteaders watched with a mixture of pity and fascination. They expected her to fail. They waited for it. On this particular morning, the sun had barely crested the peaks of the San Juan Mountains when Clara began her work. She had made a plan the night before, lying awake on the thin mattress in the soddy that Thomas had built. The south field needed plowing, the irrigation ditch required clearing after the recent rain, the fence line along the eastern boundary had collapsed and needed mending, and the chicken coop required repairs before the next storm. It was a week's worth of work for a strong man. Clara intended to finish it by nightfall. Isaac Turner had ridden into Silverton 2 days prior, trailing a string of horses he intended to sell to the mining operations that scarred the mountainsides. He was a cowboy in the truest sense, a man who had spent the better part of his 30 years moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled at his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the prairie, and they held a sharpness that came from years of reading land, animals, and men with equal skill. He had sold his horses for a good price and planned to move on within the week, but Silverton had a decent saloon, and the mountains were pretty enough to warrant a few days' rest. He was drinking coffee outside the general store when he first heard the men talking about the widow Garrison. "Poor creature won't last another week," said a thick-bellied man named Henderson, who owned the claim just north of the Garrison property. "She was out there at first light yesterday, trying to plow. The woman can barely lift the handles." "Someone ought to talk sense into her," another man agreed. "It is not right, watching her kill herself over that worthless land. Thomas was a fool to settle there, and she is a fool to stay." Isaac sipped his coffee and said nothing. He had learned long ago that other people's business was best left to other people, and a widow's choices were her own. But something in the conversation nagged at him throughout the morning, and when he rode out of town later to exercise one of the horses he had kept for himself, he found his path taking him toward the Garrison claim almost without conscious thought. He reached the property around midday and stopped his horse on a small rise that overlooked the land. What he saw made him lean forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. The woman working in the field below was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, if that, with hair the color of dark honey pulled back in a braid that hung to her waist. Her dress was faded and patched, and even from this distance he could see that it hung loose on her frame. She should have looked fragile, breakable. Instead, she moved with a ferocious efficiency that Isaac had rarely seen even in seasoned ranch hands. As he watched, Clara finished plowing a row, turned the hand plow with practiced ease, and began the next. The plow was clearly too heavy for her. Her arms shook with the effort of keeping it steady, and her breathing came hard enough that he could see her shoulders heaving. But she did not stop. She did not slow. She drove forward with a grim determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. Isaac dismounted and tied his horse to a scrub oak, then walked down the hill toward the field. He had no clear plan, no reason for approaching her except curiosity, and something else he could not quite name. As he drew closer, he could see the details the distance had hidden. The way her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth that were stained with old blood, the sweat that darkened her dress between her shoulder blades, the tremor in her legs that spoke of exhaustion so profound it was a miracle she was still standing. She did not notice him until he was nearly at the edge of the field. Then she looked up, and he found himself meeting eyes the color of spring grass, green and bright, and burning with something that took his breath away. It was not anger exactly, though there was anger there. It was more than that. It was defiance. It was refusal. It was a soul that had looked into the abyss and decided to fight. "Can I help you?" Her voice was hoarse, probably from lack of use. Who did she have to talk to out here after all? "I was passing by," Isaac said, which was not quite a lie. "Thought you might want a hand with the work. I am managing fine on my own." She turned back to the plow, dismissing him. Isaac glanced around the property, taking in the scope of what she was attempting. The field she was plowing was only half finished. Beyond it, he could see the collapsed fence line, the clogged irrigation ditch, the damage to the chicken coop. It was an impossible amount of work for one person, let alone a woman her size. "No offense, madam, but you do not look fine." She stopped plowing and straightened, turning to face him fully. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the hollows in her cheeks, the way her whole body swayed slightly as though she might collapse at any moment. But her jaw was set and her eyes were fierce. "I did not ask for your opinion, Mr. Turner, Isaac Turner." "Well, Mr. Turner, I appreciate your concern, but I do not need help. I do not need pity. I do not need some stranger telling me what I can and cannot do. This is my land, my work, and I will manage it myself." There was a tremor in her voice on the last words, a crack in the armor that she quickly covered. Isaac recognized it for what it was: pride. The same pride that made cowboys ride broncs that should not be ridden, that made men walk away from fights they should run from, that made people cling to impossible dreams long past the point of reason. It was pride that would kill her if she kept this pace. "I am not offering pity," he said quietly. "I am offering help. There is a difference. I do not want your help." She turned back to the plow, gripped the handles, and pushed forward. The plow moved 3 feet before catching on a rock hidden in the soil. The impact sent Clara stumbling forward, and she would have fallen if Isaac had not moved fast, catching her arm and steadying her. For a moment, they stood there, his hand on her arm, her weight leaning against him. He could feel her trembling, the fine shaking that came from muscles pushed far beyond their limits. She looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes shift. Not surrender exactly, but perhaps the first crack in her resolve. "When did you last eat?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. She blinked, then frowned. I had breakfast." "What did you have?" She hesitated. "Coffee. That is not breakfast." "It is all I needed." Isaac released her arm and stepped back, studying her. She was swaying on her feet now, barely able to stand. Her lips had a faint blue tinge, and her skin was pale beneath the sunburn. She was going to collapse, probably within the next hour, and if she did it out here alone, she might not get back up. "All right," he said. "Here's what is going to happen. I am going to finish plowing this field. You are going to sit down in the shade and drink some water. Then you are going to eat the jerky and biscuits I have in my saddlebag. When you have done that, if you still want to work, you can help me with the fence line. But you are not touching this plow again today. You cannot. I can, and I am. You can argue with me if you want, but that will just waste time and energy you do not have. So what will it be?" Clara stared at him, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride versus practicality. Stubbornness versus survival. Finally, slowly, she nodded. "Fine, but only for today. Tomorrow, I work alone. We will see about tomorrow when tomorrow comes." Isaac retrieved the food from his saddlebag and made Clara sit in the shade of the soddy while she ate. She devoured the food with a hunger that confirmed what he suspected. She had been starving herself, probably without even realizing it, too focused on work to bother with things like eating and resting. He brought her water from the creek and made her drink that too, then returned to the field. The plow was heavier than it looked, and the soil was thick with rocks and roots. Isaac understood immediately why Thomas Garrison had been considered a fool for settling here. This was brutal land, the kind that broke men's backs and spirits with equal efficiency. But it was not impossible land. With enough work, enough determination, it could be made to yield. The question was whether that work would kill the person doing it first. He plowed until the sun reached its zenith, then kept going. The field was larger than it had looked from the rise, and the plow caught on obstacles every few feet. But Isaac had grown up working land like this, had spent his youth breaking sod on the Kansas plains before drifting west to work cattle. The rhythm of the work was familiar, almost meditative. Push, lift, turn, push again. Watch the soil, feel the resistance, adjust. When he finally finished the field and looked up, the sun had moved well past its high point. He was soaked with sweat, and his shoulders ached, but the satisfaction of seeing straight, even rows, was worth the effort. He walked back to the soddy and found Clara exactly where he had left her, sitting in the shade. But she was not resting. She had found a basket of eggs that needed cleaning and was working through them with focused attention. "I thought you were supposed to be resting," Isaac said. "I rested while I ate. Now I am working." He shook his head but did not argue. At least she was sitting down and doing something that would not kill her. "Field is done. I am going to start on that fence. I will help you. You will sit there and finish those eggs. Mr. Turner!" "Isaac." She paused, seeming thrown by the informality. "Isaac, I appreciate what you have done today, truly. But I cannot have you doing all my work while I sit idle. It is not right. What is not right is you working yourself to death because you are too stubborn to accept help." "I am not stubborn." Isaac raised an eyebrow, and after a moment, Clara's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. It transformed her face, softening the hard lines that grief and exhaustion had carved there. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of who she must have been before Thomas died, before the weight of the world settled on her small shoulders. "All right," she admitted. "Perhaps I am a little stubborn." "A little," he agreed, and this time she did smile. A real one, small and fleeting, but genuine. They worked together through the afternoon. Isaac handled the heavy repairs on the fence, driving new posts into the hard ground and stringing wire, while Clara gathered the tools he needed and helped where she could. She did not talk much, but her presence was steady and her assistance invaluable. She knew the property intimately, could tell him where Thomas had stored supplies, which posts were rotted through, and which were still sound, where the wire was most likely to catch and tangle. As they worked, Isaac found himself studying her in quick glances. She was not pretty in the conventional sense. Her face was too thin, her features too sharp, her skin too weathered by sun and wind. But there was something compelling about her nonetheless, something in the set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes that drew his attention again and again. She was like one of the wild mustangs he had spent years working with, small and fierce and absolutely refusing to be broken. By the time the sun began to sink behind the mountains, they had finished the fence and cleared half the irrigation ditch. Clara's movements had grown slower as the day progressed, her energy flagging despite the food and rest. When Isaac finally called a halt to the work, she did not argue. "You will come back tomorrow?" she asked as he prepared to leave. The question was tentative, almost shy, as though she was afraid of the answer. Isaac looked at her, at this tiny woman who had outworked most men he knew, who had faced impossible odds and refused to yield, who had buried her husband and then picked up his tools and kept going. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he could not quite name, but that settled into place with a rightness that surprised him. "I will come back tomorrow," he said. And he did. He came back the next day, and the next, and the next after that. Each morning, he rode out from town before dawn and found Clara already awake, already working. Together, they tackled the endless list of tasks that the property demanded. They finished clearing the irrigation ditch and repaired the chicken coop. They planted seed in the freshly plowed field and built a new gate for the corral. They hauled rocks from the creek bed to reinforce the foundation of the soddy and patched the roof where it leaked. The work was hard and hot and often frustrating, but Isaac found himself looking forward to it with an eagerness that was entirely unfamiliar. He told himself it was because Clara needed the help, because it was the decent thing to do. He told himself he would stay only until the most urgent work was finished, until she was secure enough to manage on her own. But as the days turned into weeks, he realized he was lying to himself. The truth was that Clara Garrison had gotten under his skin. It was not just her fierce determination, though that was part of it. It was not just her refusal to give up, though he admired that more than he could say. It was something deeper, something in the way she laughed when the irrigation ditch finally flowed clear after days of work, something in the way she spoke softly to the chickens as she scattered their feed, something in the quiet moments when they sat together in the evening after the work was done and watched the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. She was coming back to life before his eyes. The hollows in her cheeks filled in. The dark circles under her eyes faded. She smiled more readily, laughed more easily. The brittle edges of her grief began to soften, and underneath he discovered a woman who was intelligent and curious, and possessed of a dry wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh out loud. They talked while they worked, conversations that ranged from the practical to the profound. She told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about her father's small farm and her mother's herb garden, about the way Thomas had swept into her life with his grand plans and bigger dreams. She had married him at 19, she said, and followed him west at 20, and now here she was at 21, a widow trying to make sense of a life that had taken a turn she never expected. Isaac told her about his own past, about growing up on the Kansas plains, about his father who had died in the war, and his mother who had followed him a year later, about the years he had spent drifting because staying still felt too much like giving up. He told her about the ranches he had worked, the cattle drives he had ridden, the horses he had broken, and the men he had known. He told her things he had never told anyone, and she listened with an attention that made him feel heard in a way he never had before. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after he had first arrived at her property, they sat together on the steps of the soddy and watched the sunset. The day's work was done, the tools put away, the animals fed and watered. Clara had made coffee, and they drank it in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have grown easy with each other. "I have been thinking," Clara said finally, breaking the quiet, "about what comes next." Isaac's chest tightened. He had been trying not to think about what came next, trying not to acknowledge that his reasons for staying were becoming harder and harder to justify. The urgent work was done. The property was in good shape. Clara was healthy and strong, more than capable of managing on her own. He had no reason to stay, no excuse, except that he did not want to leave. "What have you been thinking?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "I want to expand the garden," she said. "Thomas always said the growing season was too short up here, that we should focus on livestock instead, but I think he was wrong. I think with the right crops and proper planning, I could have a garden that produces enough to sell in town, maybe even preserve food to sell through the winter." Isaac felt relief wash through him, though he was not entirely sure why. "That is a good plan. Silverton needs fresh produce. The miners will pay well for it. I will need help building the garden beds, and the soil will need amending, and I will need to figure out what grows best at this altitude." She turned to look at him, her green eyes catching the last light of the sunset. "I was hoping you might stay and help me with that." There it was, the question he had been both dreading and hoping for. Isaac knew he should say no. He knew he should mount his horse, ride back to town, and keep moving the way he always had. Staying meant putting down roots, and roots meant pain when they were inevitably torn up. He had learned that lesson young, and learned it well. But when he looked at Clara, at the hope and uncertainty in her eyes, at the way she was trying so hard to keep her expression neutral, even though he could see how much his answer mattered to her, he found that the old lessons did not seem to apply anymore. "I will stay," he said. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, bright and warm and full of promise. "Good," she said simply. "That is good." They started work on the garden the next day. Isaac built raised beds from timber he hauled from the forest above the property, while Clara amended the soil with compost and manure she acquired from Henderson, who seemed shocked that the widow Garrison was not only still alive, but thriving. Together they planned the layout, discussing which vegetables would grow best, where to place them for optimal sun and water, how to protect them from the late frosts that could strike even in summer at this altitude. As they worked, Isaac became increasingly aware of how much he enjoyed Clara's company, how right it felt to be working beside her, how natural it seemed to share meals and conversation and comfortable silences. He caught himself watching her more often, noticing the way the sun brought out copper highlights in her hair, the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. He was falling in love with her. The realization came to him one morning as he watched her coax seedlings out of the earth with gentle fingers and a patience that bordered on reverence. He was falling in love with her, and the knowledge terrified him because he had no idea if she felt the same way or if she simply saw him as a friend, a hired hand, a temporary fixture in her life that would eventually move on. But even fear could not make him leave. He stayed through May and into June, watching the garden grow and the fields turn green with new wheat. He stayed through the long days of summer when the work seemed endless and the sun beat down with relentless heat. He stayed through the cool evenings when they sat together and talked about everything and nothing, when the space between them seemed to shrink until it was barely there at all. It was Clara who finally bridged that last small gap. They had been working on a new irrigation system for the garden, digging trenches and laying pipe in the baking sun. The work was exhausting, and by the time they finished, both were covered in dirt and sweat. Clara had gone to the creek to wash, and when she returned, her hair was loose and damp around her shoulders, water droplets still clinging to her skin. Isaac looked up from the fire he was building and forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful. Not despite her work-hardened hands and sun-weathered skin, but because of them. She was beautiful because she was strong, because she had faced the worst life could throw at her and refused to break, because she had taken a dying claim and brought it back to life through sheer force of will and determination. "Isaac," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that made him stand, made him turn to face her fully. "I need to tell you something." His heart was hammering in his chest, hope and fear warring for dominance. "All right," I know you plan to move on eventually. I know you have been staying to help me, and I am grateful for that. More grateful than I can possibly express. She took a breath, seemed to gather her courage. But I need you to know that I do not want you to go. Not because I need your help, though I appreciate it, but because I... She trailed off, her cheeks flushing. Because I have come to care for you. Very much. Isaac closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He took her hands in his, marveling at how small they were, how strong. Clara, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you the same thing. I love you. I have loved you for weeks now. I want to stay. Not as a hired hand or a friend, but as your husband if you will have me. Her eyes widened, shining with tears. You want to marry me? More than I have ever wanted anything. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. I know it is fast. I know Thomas has only been gone a few months. But I cannot imagine leaving you, Clara. I cannot imagine waking up and not seeing you, not working beside you, not sitting with you in the evening and listening to you talk about your plans for the garden. You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Isaac. Yes. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, pouring all the love and admiration and respect he felt into that single moment. She kissed him back with equal tenderness, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and for a long moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the taste of creek water on her lips, the feel of her body pressed against his, the rightness of finally holding her. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and smiling. Isaac rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. Tomorrow, he said, we will go into town tomorrow and talk to the preacher. Clara laughed, the sound bright and joyful. Tomorrow, she agreed. They rode into Silverton together the next morning, and if the townspeople were surprised to see the widow Garrison arriving with Isaac Turner, they were even more surprised when the couple emerged from the preacher's house with plans for a wedding in 3 days' time. The news spread through town like wildfire, generating gossip and speculation, and from some quarters disapproval. There were those who thought it unseemly for Clara to remarry so soon after Thomas's death, who whispered that she was disrespecting his memory, or that Isaac was taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. But there were others who had watched Clara work herself nearly to death, who had seen her refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless, who understood that life in the West was too hard and too short to waste on propriety when happiness was within reach. These people, the ones who mattered, offered their congratulations and their blessings. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in late June of 1881. The preacher's wife had helped Clara make a simple dress of pale blue calico, and someone had brought wildflowers from the high meadows to serve as a bouquet. Isaac wore his best shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine. They stood together before the preacher in the small church, Clara's hand in his, and spoke their vows with voices that were clear and steady and full of promise. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one eye in the congregation. Clara kissed him back with equal feeling, and when they turned to face their neighbors, both were smiling with a joy that could not be contained. There was a celebration afterward at the boarding house with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Isaac danced with his wife, holding her close and marveling at the fact that she was his now, that this remarkable woman had chosen him, that they would build a life together on the land she had fought so hard to keep. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Isaac and Clara slipped away and rode back to their homestead now, under a sky full of stars. They did not speak during the ride, but the silence was comfortable and full of anticipation. When they reached the soddy, Isaac helped Clara down from her horse and then lifted her in his arms, carrying her over the threshold in the traditional way. He set her down gently inside, and she turned in his arms to face him. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint light from the stove, but he could see her eyes shining, could see the love and trust and desire in her expression. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she responded with a passion that matched his own. They consummated their marriage that night with a tenderness and care that spoke of the depth of their feelings for each other. Isaac was gentle with Clara, mindful of her inexperience, and she was bold in her responses, unafraid to show him what she wanted, what she needed. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders, both utterly content. "I love you," Clara whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Isaac replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I will love you every day for the rest of my life." And he did. They fell into a rhythm of life together that felt as natural as breathing. They woke together each morning and worked together each day, their efforts no longer driven by desperation, but by hope and shared purpose. The garden flourished under Clara's care, producing vegetables that they sold in town for good prices. The wheat in the fields grew tall and golden, promising a harvest that would see them through the winter and beyond. Isaac built a proper house that summer, using timber from the forest and stone from the creek bed. It was not large or fancy, but it was solid and well made, with real windows and a floor that did not turn to mud when it rained. Clara made curtains for the windows and rugs for the floor, transforming the simple structure into a home. As the months passed, they became a fixture in the community. Isaac took on occasional work with some of the larger ranches, helping with cattle drives or breaking horses, bringing in extra income that allowed them to improve the property further. Clara became known for her garden produce and for the preserves she made, which sold for premium prices in town and even found their way to the mining camps higher in the mountains. But more than their success, more than the prosperity that slowly came to them, what people noticed was the way they were together. The way Isaac looked at Clara with a pride and admiration that was almost palpable. The way Clara smiled at her husband with a joy that lit her from within. They were partners in the truest sense, each supporting the other, each making the other stronger. In the spring of 1882, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Isaac one evening as they sat together on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset over the mountains. He had been talking about plans for expanding the wheat field, and she had waited for a pause in the conversation before reaching out to take his hand. "Isaac," she said softly, "we are going to have a baby." He went very still, his gray-blue eyes searching her face. "A baby? Are you certain?" "I am certain. The baby should arrive in the fall, around October if my calculations are correct." For a moment he said nothing, and Clara felt a flutter of anxiety. Then a smile broke across his face, so wide and bright that it transformed his usually serious features. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she could feel him trembling. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, we are going to have a baby." She laughed, tears of happiness streaming down her face. We really are." Isaac was fiercely protective throughout her pregnancy, insisting that she take on only the lightest work, hiring help from town to handle the heavier tasks. Clara tolerated his hovering with good-natured amusement, working as much as he would allow and resting when he insisted. As her belly grew round with their child, Isaac would spend evenings with his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick and move, marveling at the life they had created together. The baby came in mid-October, a long, difficult labor that left Isaac pacing outside while the midwife and her assistant worked inside. When the midwife finally emerged to tell him he had a son, he nearly fell over with relief. She let him inside, and he found Clara exhausted but smiling, their infant son wrapped in a blanket and cradled against her chest. "A boy," she said softly. "We have a boy, Isaac." He sat beside her on the bed, looking down at the tiny red face of his son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were currently dark blue, but would likely change color in the coming weeks. He was perfect. Absolutely perfect. What should we name him? Clara asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Isaac knew exactly what the boy's name should be. James, he said. James Thomas Turner. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Thomas. After her first husband, the man whose death had brought her and Isaac together in the first place. It was a generous gesture, an acknowledgement that James Thomas had been part of Clara's life, part of her story, and that his memory deserved to be honored rather than erased. James Thomas Turner, Clara repeated softly. It is perfect. James was a healthy baby with a powerful set of lungs and an appetite that kept Clara busy. Isaac was a devoted father, helping with the baby whenever he could, getting up in the night to walk with James when he was fussy, sitting for hours just watching him sleep. Fatherhood transformed him, softening some of the hard edges that years of drifting had created, giving him an anchor that went even deeper than his love for Clara. Life settled into a new rhythm that included the demands of a baby. Clara balanced motherhood with her work in the garden, often with James strapped to her back in a carrier that Isaac had fashioned from leather and canvas. Isaac continued to work the land and take on occasional jobs in town, but he always made sure to be home by evening, unwilling to miss any more time with his wife and son than necessary. The years that followed were good ones. The homestead prospered. The harvests were strong, and Clara's garden became so successful that they built a second, larger one to meet the demand from town. Isaac acquired more land, purchased from Henderson when the older man decided to return east, and used it to expand their wheat fields and start a small herd of cattle. James grew from baby to toddler to young boy, quick and bright and full of questions about everything around him. He learned to walk by following his mother through the garden rows, learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, learned the rhythms of the land and the satisfaction of hard work from both his parents. When James was 3, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she continued working almost until the day she went into labor. The baby, another boy they named William after Isaac's father, arrived on a cold February morning in 1886. He was smaller than James had been, but just as healthy, with his mother's green eyes and a temperament that was noticeably calmer than his older brother's. The house seemed to shrink with 2 active children, and Isaac began planning an expansion, adding rooms to accommodate their growing family. Clara, watching him sketch out his plans one evening, asked if he thought they would need even more space in the future. Perhaps, he said with a grin. Are you telling me something, Mrs. Turner? She laughed and shook her head. Not yet, but I would like a daughter eventually. The boys need a sister to keep them in line. Isaac pulled her into his lap, kissing her soundly. Then we will keep trying until we get you a daughter. It is a sacrifice, I know, but I am willing to make it. Clara swatted his shoulder, laughing. You are incorrigible. You love it. I love you, she corrected, kissing him back. Their daughter arrived 2 years later, in the spring of 1888. The labor was mercifully short, and when the midwife placed the squalling infant in Clara's arms, both parents were overcome with emotion. She was tiny and perfect, with a dusting of reddish gold hair and eyes that were already clearly green. Catherine, Clara said immediately. Her name is Catherine. Catherine Grace Turner, Isaac agreed, running a gentle finger down his daughter's soft cheek. Welcome to the world, little one. James, now 6, and William, now 2, were fascinated by their baby sister. James took his role as big brother seriously, always checking to make sure Catherine was all right, bringing her toys and trying to make her laugh. William was more interested in examining her with the focused attention of a toddler, trying to understand how this new small person fit into his world. The Turner homestead became known throughout the region as one of the most successful in the area. Other homesteaders came to Isaac for advice on crops and land management, and Clara became something of an authority on high-altitude gardening. They were respected in the community, their opinions sought on matters ranging from town planning to school curricula. But despite their success and their standing, they never forgot where they had started. Clara still told the story of those first desperate weeks after Thomas's death, of the day Isaac had appeared on the rise overlooking her field and offered help. She told it to their children when they were old enough to understand, wanting them to know that their family had been built on hard work and determination and the kind of love that grows when two people choose to face the world together. Isaac never forgot the sight of Clara in that field, tiny and exhausted and refusing to give up. Whenever things were difficult, whenever they faced setbacks or challenges, he would remember that moment and draw strength from it. If Clara could face down impossible odds with nothing but determination and a hand plow, they could handle anything together. The years continued to pass, bringing change and growth and new challenges. The West was changing, becoming more settled, more civilized. The wild days of the frontier were giving way to something more stable, more permanent. Silverton grew from a rough mining camp into a proper town with schools and churches and businesses. The railroad came through in 1890, connecting them more firmly to the wider world. Through it all, the Turners remained rooted in their land and in each other. They weathered droughts and hard winters, good years and lean ones. They raised their three children with love and discipline, teaching them the value of hard work, the importance of education, and the strength that comes from family. James grew into a tall young man with his father's build and his mother's determination. He went to school in Durango for 2 years to learn engineering, then returned home to help his father implement new irrigation techniques that dramatically improved their yields. William was quieter than his brother, more thoughtful with a head for numbers and a passion for reading. He talked about becoming a lawyer, about going east to attend university. Catherine, the baby who was not so much a baby anymore, was fierce and bold and utterly unafraid of anything. She could ride as well as any boy in the county, could shoot straight and work hard, and had her mother's gift with growing things. In the summer of 1895, Isaac and Clara stood together on the porch of their house and watched their children working in the fields. James was overseeing the irrigation system he had designed. William was tallying the expected harvest yields in a ledger, and Catherine was in the garden, harvesting vegetables with practiced efficiency. "Look at them," Clara said softly, leaning against her husband's side. "Look at what we made." Isaac wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She was 45 now, her dark honey hair shot through with silver, her face lined by years of sun and laughter. She was more beautiful to him than she had been at 21, more precious, more essential. "I look at them every day," he said, "and I cannot quite believe they are ours." "Do you ever think about how different things might have been," she asked, "if you had not ridden past that day? If you had not stopped?" Isaac thought about the path his life had been on before Clara, the endless drifting, the lack of purpose, the loneliness that he had tried to pretend was freedom. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "and I thank God every time that I did stop. You changed my life, Clara. You gave me a reason to stay, a reason to build something lasting. Everything good in my life came from you." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "You saved me," she said. "When I was drowning in grief and exhaustion and stubbornness, you threw me a rope. You saw me, Isaac, not the broken widow everyone else saw, but the person I was underneath. You saw my strength when I could not see it myself. You always had that strength. I just helped you recognize it." "We helped each other," she corrected. "We built this life together, every piece of it, and I would not change a single moment, not even the hard ones, because they all led us here." Isaac kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that held 14 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured against her hair. "It was not luck," Clara said. "It was choice. You chose to stop. I chose to let you help. We chose each other every day since then. And I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." They stood there together as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, watching their children, their land, their life spread out before them. It had not been easy. There had been struggles and setbacks, moments of doubt and fear, but they had faced everything together, and together they had built something that would last long after they were gone. James would eventually take over the homestead, bringing his own wife and children to live on the land his parents had carved from the wilderness. William would go east to study law as he dreamed, but he would return to Colorado to practice, settling in Denver but visiting home regularly. Catherine would marry a rancher from the next valley over, a good man who respected her strength and matched it with his own. But all of that was still to come. For now, in this moment, Isaac and Clara stood together in the evening light and were simply content. They had each other. They had their family. They had their land. They had built a life from nothing, from grief and desperation, and the simple act of one person offering help to another. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, silent witnesses to the small human dramas that played out in their shadow. And on a homestead in the Colorado wilderness, a family finished their day's work and gathered together for the evening meal, bound by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. Years later, when Isaac and Clara were old and their children had children of their own, the story of how they met would become a favorite at family gatherings. The grandchildren would cluster around Clara, begging her to tell them again about the day the cowboy came down from the hill and saw her working in the field. They wanted to hear about the hand plow and the impossible work, about their grandmother's stubbornness and their grandfather's quiet determination, about how love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. Clara would oblige them, her voice still strong despite her years, her green eyes still bright with memory. She would tell them about Thomas, making sure his memory was honored, explaining that sometimes love comes more than once in a life if you are brave enough to open your heart again. She would tell them about the exhaustion and the grief, about the moment she collapsed in the dirt and thought she might die there. And then she would tell them about looking up and seeing Isaac standing at the edge of the field, this stranger who offered help without judgment, who saw strength where others saw only weakness, who stayed when he could have left, who chose her when he could have chosen the easy road of drifting forever. Your grandfather saved my life that day, she would say. But more than that, he gave me a reason to keep living it. He showed me that strength is not about doing everything alone. It is about knowing when to accept help, when to let someone stand beside you, when to build something together that neither of you could build apart. Isaac, sitting beside her, would take her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. And your grandmother, he would add, taught me what it means to have courage, real courage, the kind that gets up every morning and faces the impossible and refuses to quit. I had been drifting for years before I met her, thinking that moving meant living. But she showed me that putting down roots takes more bravery than running ever did. The grandchildren would listen with rapt attention, storing up the story to tell their own children someday. And when the evening grew late and it was time for bed, they would kiss their grandparents good night and go off to dream of cowboys and homesteads, of love that conquers adversity, of the romance and reality of the West. On a warm summer evening in 1910, Isaac and Clara sat together on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands nearly 30 years earlier. They were both in their 70s now, their bodies aged, but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. The homestead sprawled around them, nearly 500 acres now, worked by James and his sons with the help of hired hands. The original soddy was still standing, preserved as a reminder of where they had started, but it was dwarfed by the house and the barn and the other outbuildings that had been added over the years. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" Clara asked, her hand in Isaac's, as it had been countless times before. "I remember everything about us," he said. "Every moment, every conversation, every smile, every tear. It is all here." He tapped his chest over his heart. "We have had a good life," she said. "A very good life." The best, he agreed. I was a tumbleweed before you, Clara, just blowing wherever the wind took me. You gave me a place to land, a reason to stay. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything, she corrected gently, just as she always did. That is how love works. It is not one person saving another. It is two people choosing to walk the same path, to face the same direction, to build something together. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains stood black against the deep blue of twilight, their peaks still touched with the last light of the sun. From inside the house came the sounds of family, James's wife preparing dinner, the grandchildren playing, the ordinary noises of life being lived. I would do it all again, Clara said suddenly. Every hard moment, every struggle, every challenge, I would do it all again just to end up right here, right now, with you. Isaac raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. As would I. 1,000 times over, I would choose you. They had been married for 29 years, and in all that time, Isaac had never stopped marveling at the woman beside him. She was still fierce, still determined, still possessed of a strength that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the power of her spirit. She had been an equal partner in every way, working beside him to build their life, raising their children with wisdom and love, standing firm when times were hard and celebrating with joy when times were good. And Clara, for her part, still looked at her husband with the same love and admiration she had felt the day he came down from the hill and offered to help a struggling widow. He had kept every promise he made to her, had been faithful and true, had worked hard and loved harder. He had given her a life she never could have imagined in those dark days after Thomas died, when she thought her world had ended. Instead, it had just been the beginning. The years that remained to them passed peacefully. They grew older together, their bodies slowing but their spirits still strong. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own. They saw the 20th century bring changes they could never have anticipated, saw the automobile replace the horse, saw electricity come to Silverton, saw the world transform around them, while their love remained constant. Isaac Turner died in his sleep in the winter of 1912, with Clara beside him as she had been for more than 3 decades. He passed peacefully, his hand in hers, his last words a whispered declaration of love. Clara held him as his breathing slowed and stopped, held him as the light left his eyes, held him as the sun rose over the mountains they had loved together. She grieved him deeply, but without the desperate edge that had characterized her grief for Thomas. This was different. This was the sorrow of losing the great love of her life, the partner who had stood beside her through everything, but it was tempered by gratitude for every moment they had shared. They had been given more than 30 years together, 3 children, grandchildren beyond counting, and a love that had never wavered. How many people could say the same? Clara lived for 3 more years after Isaac's death, remaining in the house he had built, surrounded by family, still tending her garden every day the weather allowed. She died on a bright morning in May of 1915, sitting in the garden with the sun on her face and the smell of growing things all around her. James found her there, peaceful and still, a small smile on her face. They buried her next to Isaac on a hillside overlooking the land they had worked together, the land that had nearly killed her and then had given her everything. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and dates, and a single inscription that Clara had requested years earlier. Together, we built a life. Together, we built a love. Together, we built a home. The homestead remained in the Turner family for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Isaac and Clara had laid. The tale of the cowboy who saw a widow's strength and married her became family legend, told and retold until it achieved a mythic quality, though the core truth remained unchanged. Two people had found each other in the hardest of circumstances and had chosen to build something beautiful together. In the end, their legacy was not just the land or the family or the success they had achieved. It was the example they set of what love could be when it was based on mutual respect, shared labor, and the fundamental belief that together, two people could face anything the world threw at them. It was the knowledge that strength comes in many forms, that courage can look like getting up one more time after falling, that the most profound act of bravery is opening your heart after it has been broken. The homestead still stands, more than a century after Clara first collapsed in its fields, and Isaac first rode down to help her. The original soddy is preserved as a historical site now, a reminder of those early desperate days. The house Isaac built has been added to and renovated, but its bones remain the same, solid and true. The garden where Clara worked her magic still produces, tended now by her great-great-grandchildren who have inherited her gift for making things grow. And on summer evenings, when the light turns golden and the mountains cast their long shadows across the valley, if you stand very still and listen, you might hear the echo of voices long silent, a woman's laughter bright with joy, a man's deep rumble of contentment, the sounds of a life well lived and a love well earned. You might feel, just for a moment, the presence of those who came before, who worked this land and loved this place and each other with a fierceness that time cannot erase, because that is the true magic of what Isaac and Clara built together. Not just a homestead or a family, but a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of seeing someone's true strength and choosing to stand beside them. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest loves begin with the simplest acts, offering help, accepting it, and deciding that together is better than alone. The story of the homesteader's weak wife who outworked every man and the cowboy who saw her strength and married her lives on not just in the family that descended from them, but in the land itself, in the straight rows of the fields and the thriving garden, in the solid walls of the house and the clear water flowing through the irrigation ditches. It lives in every act of courage, every moment of choosing partnership over pride, every decision to stay and build rather than run and hide. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy any love can leave. Not just the story of how it began, but the proof of what it built, enduring long after the lovers themselves have returned to dust, a testament carved not in stone, but in the very fabric of the land and the lives that followed after. Isaac and Clara Turner proved that love and hard work can transform impossible circumstances into something beautiful, that two people together can achieve what neither could alone, and that sometimes the person who saves you is the same person you end up saving in return.